Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We are a consortium of 75 or so organizations in Massachusetts planning commemorations of the beginnings of American independence. And our guest today is John Rees. John Rees is an historian. Actually, he spent most of his career both as a postal worker and as a researcher into history. And his first book was They Were Good Soldiers on African Americans who served in the Continental Army. And we're here to talk about your new book that you did with Don Troiani, the artist, Don Troiani's Black Soldiers Serving in North America's Founding War. So, John, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And so you've been researching and writing for close to 40 years about the real experiences of ordinary men and women in the armies of the Revolution, And this book really looks at Black soldiers. Don Troiani, of course, is an astounding artist, researcher, meticulous attention to detail. And your task is to explain who these people are and give this context, which you've really done masterfully. So how did you get into this subject, by the way, of the underrepresented folks in the Revolution?
Well, when I first started researching back in about 1985, I was originally wanted to research the unit that I portrayed in Living History pastime, and nobody could tell me about it. So that's where I focused my original research. But then later, I came across all these other tidbits about women, about food, about what soldiers carried. I could go on and on.
Yeah.
And luckily, I had the foresight at that point to just, since I wasn't researching that, but I just set it aside. I copied it and set it aside.
Yeah.
And that's what happened eventually with Black soldiers serving in the war. I first read Benjamin Quarles's Negroes in the American Revolution, which a lot of people might think is dated because it was written like 1962. Yeah. And yes, there's been a lot of research that's been done since then, but still it's a really, really good overview of Black service during the war. And then I started on my own coming across information on Black soldiers, some of which hadn't seen the light of day before. So I eventually that resulted in two small articles. Actually, one was a bit larger. The first article was just an overview. The second article was actually on Black soldiers serving in Southern regiments.
Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah.
Well, because everybody, I think most people would think of Southern regiments, and they would think that there can't be any Black soldiers there because of the stereotype of the 19th century South.
Right. Yeah.
And unfortunately, the 20th century South or 20th century America. But there were quite a few Black soldiers serving the Continental regiments. In fact, there were. I did a lot of calculations, and if you look at percentages compared to New England regiments, some of the Southern regiments Southern contingents actually matched up with the size of the New England regiments. And then eventually a friend convinced me to join LinkedIn, even though I really had no reason to join LinkedIn. And that was Todd Braystead, by the way. And so I joined, and about 8 years after I joined, an editor in England contacted me because I would post my articles on my LinkedIn bio. And one of the articles was Black soldiers, it was the Southern Black soldiers. And he said, well, would you want to do a book on that subject or any other? So I considered maybe doing another subject, but I knew I had to do it on the Black soldiers.
No, it's interesting because I noticed there was a British publisher who did that.
Yes, yeah.
And you found Andrew Pebbles is a character who really stands out, and he's fighting in Henry Lawrence is commanding his unit. John Lawrence is commanding the unit he's in. And he also served under Light Horse Harry Lee. Can you talk a little bit more about Andrew Pebbles, this interesting character?
There are other Black soldiers Southern Black soldiers who had some interesting histories, but he seemed to have had the most varied. He joined he joined the 15th Virginia Regiment while it was at Valley Forge, and that was in 1777, 1778. Not long after he was assigned to the 1st Continental Artillery, probably as a matros, but we don't know for sure.
Can you tell us what a matros is for those who might not know?
A matros is basically an artillery laborer.
Okay.
They're not the skilled artillerists, but they're there to do the grunt work, hauling the artillery about. And a lot of times they did take drafts out of foot regiments to augment the artillery. So he was with the artillery for a year, and then I think he had signed on for 3 years. At the end of his 3 years, he signed on with Lee's Legion. And as you said, under Harry Lee, who of course was the father of Robert E. Lee.
Right. Yeah.
And he was at I think it was at Utah Springs. He got 3 wounds, and then eventually he served in the Deep South in South Carolina, and he was at the battle, the Combahee River, where John Lawrence was killed, and that occurred right before he was mustered out.
Yeah.
So it's and then on top of that, he left as did a few other soldiers. He left in his pension file. There's a piece where he's saying that I think he was working for a miller. But his wife and his daughter were both enslaved, and this would have been during the war, but also post-war. So with my first book, especially, I tried to talk about what happened to these soldiers post-war, and tried to extend it on into the 19th century, so you could see a little bit of where the army and where those soldiers ended up, and where society was heading at that point.
Yeah. I mean, you make the point that some were free, some were enslaved, and I wonder if you talk a little bit about that, as it gets also to motivation for service and other things.
Well, that's the most interesting. I mean, I think I've always thought it was interesting, but in the light of recent research, there's an August 1778 return of 15 brigades of Washington's army, and it's called The Return of the Negroes in the Army. For the longest time, we thought that those were all the black soldiers in the army, but in his discussion with my friend and cousin and excellent researcher Matthew White, he's done an in-depth study on that return. It basically shows that those were all the enslaved soldiers in the army. So at that point, there were 755 enslaved soldiers in the army. What we don't know at that point is how many free soldiers were in the army, and it's possible they were on par with the enslaved soldiers. It's even possible that they were fewer than the enslaved soldiers, but we just don't know. And even though actually he just found out that he's doing a lot of great work. He just found out that there was a black soldier and enslaved soldiers served in 1775. I think I can't remember. I think it's a 26th Continental Regiment, but I can't quite remember. But and as a result of the paper discussion of whether black soldiers were going to serve in 1775, and the thing is, during that whole paper discussion, those black soldiers continued to serve. Right. During 1775 and on to 1776. But with the new recruiting instructions in February 1776, all it says was it wanted free men. They wanted to enlist free men, no slaves. So this man actually does not appear on the rolls in 1776. So they actually stood by that. But even though he was with the regiment, because he was enslaved by one of the officers. Interesting. And then he enlisted again in 1777. And if you look at Connecticut, especially Connecticut, but even Massachusetts and even southern states, a lot of those states, but especially Connecticut and to a lesser extent Massachusetts, they had a lot of enslaved soldiers. A lot of it was masters placing their slaves in the armies, basically in place of the masters serving themselves. Sometimes the slaves enlisted without the master's knowledge. And John Hannigan, who's also done a lot of great work,
Yes.
he found an account of, I think it's 1781, and I think the man was actually a levy. It would have been a short-term levy with the Continental Army. But his master came to claim him at West Point, and the officer said, "No, he's enlisted. You can have him when his enlistment was over." And there are instances when masters were allowed to take their slaves out of the army when they enlisted without. But in this instance, they wouldn't release them. So there's so many great stories, and this is just in in the 8 years 1775, 1783. So when you take it beyond that, it just really opens it up.
Yeah. Now, one of the many interesting things about the book is it starts before the Revolution with the 7 Years' War, which you don't often think about, but you show how much black service there was in that war. I mean, and you do have really looking at it it varies between the different states, of course. If we can talk a little bit about some of the engagements or some of the work that's going on in the 7 Years' War.
When I did the chapter on the 7 Years' War, there had been some work done on different colonies at the time, Connecticut, Massachusetts to a certain extent, some published work, but basically I had to dig to find evidence of black soldier service in all the colonies. They did vary, like you said. They were north and south. They were by and large integrated. But there was difference in service north and south. In South Carolina, even before the war, 1740s, I think was the first instance of them doing it. They actually enlisted slaves. They had slaves in the regiments because they didn't have enough white men to fill the regiments, and it was only the most trustworthy slaves, quote unquote trustworthy slaves. But they did have them. And there's evidence of black service into the 1760s during the Cherokee Wars too. That didn't make it into the book, but I've done an addenda for the book, and that's going to make it in the addenda eventually.
Oh, very good.
When you got further north, I think Maryland totally banned black soldiers. Virginia, they allowed black soldiers, but they only allowed them in laboring roles and possibly musicians' roles too. But they were basically unarmed roles. But when you there was black service and Indian service in the Delaware regiments or Delaware companies, which basically at that time that was considered part of Pennsylvania. They were the lower counties of Pennsylvania. So they did serve in Forbes' campaign, I think, in the 3rd Battalion of the Pennsylvania Regiment. If you go further north, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, you see that they were thoroughly integrated, and they were performing armed roles and performing a lot of different roles in those units. In fact, some black soldiers went to Havana in 1762 for the siege there. So at that point, there would have been black soldiers fighting against black soldiers on the provincial side, fighting against black soldiers on the Spanish side. So it's just like the American Revolution. By and large, they were integrated. They were serving in the ranks with white soldiers. Just as in the American Revolution, from April 1775 all the way to the end of 1783, there were black soldiers fighting in the armies of the Revolution, and particularly in the Continental Army.
Interesting. We're talking with John Rees, who is the author of Don Troiani's Black Soldiers Serving in North America's Founding Wars, 1754 to 1865. So Don Troiani, of course, is the artist, so it's why it's called Don Troiani's Black Soldiers Serving. But you've done the historical research into who these people were, and
well, of course, this book, just like I was asked to write my first book by an editor, Don called me and asked me if I would be willing to do this book with him. So this was his project. I mean, we shared it, but he's the one who instigated it.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, it especially does center around his artwork. Yeah. Yeah.
And he has really done tremendous work and bringing these people to life. Really.
Mhm. Oh, sure. Oh, sure. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, see, that's why, I mean, this is what I try to do, and I don't know how successful I am at it, but Marcus Rediker and a lot of other people call it, history from the bottom up. And that's what I try for. That, I want to Don's work, brings life to these people who often weren't seen. And I try to flesh out their stories, in these works, but also all the other work I do too.
So I wonder, John, if you can just tell us how you flesh out their stories, where you get the information to be able to tell us these stories.
Well, with the American Revolution, a lot of it came from pension records.
Hmm.
There were with the French and Indian Wars, it was a little bit more difficult. I basically wanted to. I had to start from scratch largely with the French and Indian War, except for some published articles that were out there and some published dissertations too, which were hugely helpful. So I basically used the dissertations, used the sources in there. I used the published articles. I had a friend for me in South Carolina or North Carolina, Jason Melius. He did some research for me on the Southern soldiers. And then I just dug into some of the published records from the New England states, and I dug as much as I can. I mean, I basically had to do research while I wrote the articles or wrote the chapters. I was doing research, and then I would stop writing, and then actually I tried to do as much research before I wrote, but I would continue to research while I was writing. So it was,
yeah, you never really find out what you don't know until you start writing.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah. And it's amazing how much stuff, I started my career working with a typewriter, and then really early PCs, and then working in a research library. And now it's amazing how many things, especially when I did this in about a year, this book, and it's amazing how much is online now.
Yeah.
I mean, I took my, Don and I shared the advance for the book, and I took my initial advance and I bought a lot of books and I continued buying books. So, published works came into this too. And dissertations or articles that I couldn't access. The authors were more than willing when I contacted them online. They were more than willing to share their work with me. So that was a huge help. And that's all the way from the French and Indian War all the way to the end of the American Civil War. Probably one of the most fascinating conflicts, because I hadn't really done research on it, was the War of 1812. And there is actually one book that's on Black soldiers in the War of 1812, but it doesn't go as deep as I'd like. So I used that somewhat, but not a whole lot, and mostly did my own research. But that was fascinating because in the 1790s, basically the American Army banned blacks again. They banned black service. In 1802, they basically opened up enlistment to free men. So in the War of 1812, even though numbers were not that large, but it was an integrated army. But at that point, Southern officers really had a dislike of black soldiers serving in the American Army, and that really comes out because Southern soldiers really began to come to the fore in the American Army. Assumed a lot of really important positions. And also one of those rising stars of Virginian was Winfield Scott. And eventually, I think it was Calhoun, I think, who was the Secretary of War. I think that's who it was.
Well, he is after the war. He is.
But
there's John Armstrong and
William. And see, John Armstrong is interesting because he was a Pennsylvanian. He's served in the Revolution, but he was instrumental in in helping to form the only black battalion that was formed in the American Army, which was the 2nd Battalion of the 26th Infantry Regiment, U.S. Infantry Regiment. So he was very instrumental in that. But when Calhoun came to the fore in 1820, he basically banned black service from the Army, and that was followed by Winfield Scott's military manual, which also banned black service in the Army.
Interesting.
So with Southerners coming to the fore, that you could see the changes.
But I wonder, John, since you mentioned that Pebble served under, Lawrence as well as Lee, who were both Southerners, if this represents a shift in attitudes as opposed to Southerners consistently.
It very much does. Yeah, it does. In fact, again, my cousin Matt White, he's done some work on abolition and on Forrest. He was an artillery officer during the war, and he was in the 1820 Missouri debates because he was a congressman then.
Right.
He was a veteran of the war, and he had served alongside black soldiers, as did, of course, Lafayette.
Charles Pinckney.
Was it? No, this was it Charles Forrest? He was an artillery officer, very crucial to the Battle of Trenton.
Okay, yeah, Forrest, yeah.
But he had to remind the Southern congressmen who he was arguing against during the Missouri debates that black soldiers indeed did serve in the Army in the Revolution. And the thing is, most of these guys were young guys, and their fathers commanded the black soldiers during the war, but they never passed on the information that black soldiers served.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So there is a real shift between, the Revolution and the War of 1812, and then of course beyond that, in the attitude toward black soldiers. I mean, Virginia itself came, I don't know how close, but was almost on a path to abolishing slavery during the Revolution. I mean, Washington's attitudes towards slavery and towards black soldiers were changed during the war, but unfortunately, we didn't continue on that. At least for the entire country, they did eventually abolish slavery for the most part in the North, or at least set themselves on the path towards that.
We're talking with John Rees, who is the author of the text for Don Troiani's Black Soldiers Serving in North America's Founding Wars, which does actually go from 1754 until 1865. But our real focus is this earlier period when, as you said, a lot is changing. Now, another thing that you do bring up is the difference between black service in the Continental regiments as opposed to the Loyalist or British Army. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what difference there would have been.
Well, the war began with black soldiers serving in Loyalist regiments. In fact, there's information that the Queen's Rangers initially had a black company. But by the time the orders, the Howe's orders came down, banning black soldiers from serving in Loyalist regiments, and that was in early 1776. Most of those men had died. They weren't in the regiment anymore. But basically, the Loyalist regiments at that point had to discharge black soldiers. Wow. What happened though was those black soldiers they either changed to new roles. I think it seems that they were probably all discharged, but eventually they made their way back into service, or at least some black men made their way back into service as musicians and pioneers. And in what you would think of as unarmed roles, which that's not their main purpose is to fight. But there was several times, and one of those instances was a black trumpeter for Simcoe's Rangers at the Battle of Spencer's Ordinary, was cited for bravery. I think he saved an officer's life during that action. And again, he was a trumpeter, but he did have a bladed weapon with him. And that's so. And then, so by and large, post 1776, black men were relegated to unarmed roles or unarmed positions, or they weren't. That wasn't their role to be fighters. They were musicians.
Mhm.
They were pioneers. They were laborers. Um, Early on in 1776, Henry Clinton was instrumental in founding the Black Pioneers, which was a company of black laborers, but they were given uniforms,
Mhm.
and they served through the entire war. But the thing with those is the unit was formed from slaves in North Carolina.
Mhm.
When the British Army was down on the Cape Fear River, and that's where Clinton was. He was with the fleet
Mhm.
on the Cape Fear River, and the document um, founding the Black Pioneers stated that those men would be enslaved until they were discharged at the end
Mhm.
of the war.
And then what happens when they're discharged? Do they become
Then
free
they
or
were
are
free.
they?
Then they were
Okay.
made free. Yeah, yeah. But that's one of the few instances. In fact, I think it's the only instance I know of that enslaved soldiers fought on the British side.
Hmm.
Um, because by and large they were all the rest of the men who served on the British side, at least in the regiments, most of them were free. I mean, I think there were probably a few instances where officer servants served under arms
Right.
and still remained as slaves.
Mhm.
And then most interesting with the Loyalist Corps is that there were a few black soldiers in armed black soldiers in Butler's Rangers.
Mhm.
And then later in the war, December 1781, there was a company, a large company of black dragoons
Mhm.
formed in South Carolina of freed slaves, and they received training along with all the other white cavalry units in the British Army. They received training in the spring of 1782. So, and the black dragoons actually ended up being very, very good cavalrymen. They weren't a large unit, but they are mentioned in
Mhm.
various journals
Mhm.
as doing really good work. But also, the government of South Carolina, as it then stood, the Whig government of South Carolina,
Yeah.
basically stated that if they were captured, they would be hung.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so they were literally fighting for their lives. The most interesting, well, not the most, but to add the icing on the cake was the remnants of the Black Dragoons and the remnants of the Southern Company of the Black Pioneers, because there was a company formed in the South
Mhm.
that stayed in the South. They eventually formed the Carolina Corps. Um, I think they went to Grenada. I'm not sure, but they were an armed loyalist corps in the West Indies under
Wow.
the British government, and then the remnants of the Carolina Corps eventually was rolled into the First West India Regiment in 1795, 1797. So they continued their legacy when the Black West Indian regiments were formed in the late 1790s.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, and you also talk about the Spanish West Indies and the Haitian soldiers who served both under the Spanish and under the French in this. I mean, it's another really
Yeah,
interesting piece
that's
of it.
the I got no direction for the narrative. Don was very specific with the captions. He said he wanted
Right.
900 word captions, which is a very large caption,
It
but
is. It is.
it's great because it gave me the ability to tell a short story in those captions.
Mm.
Um, but with the narrative, I just wrote large.
Right.
When I was writing, I wrote large, and eventually I called the editor, or I talked to the editor and said, this is what I have, and it's going to, if you want to take a look at it. And she said, well, just keep on writing as you are. Well, eventually, I had to half the size of the book.
Wow.
I had, which luckily I have a lot of experience with that kind of work, but also um, a lot of the work was these large chapters on like the French
Yeah.
Black Regiment, the Spanish Black Regiment, or the Cuban Black Regiment, and also the Rhode Island Regiment and the Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment.
Hmm.
So basically, I cut those out entirely and it's covered in captions. It's in a
Okay.
condensed form, so I just let those stand. But the stories of the French and Cuban, Spanish Cuban Black Corps are fascinating, and even even the French chasseur volunteer chasseur de Saint-Domingue, that story actually goes back into the 7 Years' War,
Mm-hmm.
and it continues, of course, up to the French Revolution, where at least some of the participants in that regiment, took part in the revolutions.
Right.
But I find the most fascinating story is the black battalions, the black Cuban battalions.
Yeah.
Because first of all, the chasseurs, the French the Haitian or Saint-Domingue chasseurs were segregated by companies. So you had a mulatto company and a black company. So the mulattoes and the blacks didn't serve together in companies. Well, in the Cuban black battalions, they served together. There were mulatto battalions and there were black battalions. So they were segregated by battalions, because there's always, even to this day, in majority of black countries, and I'm sure in America too, there is colorism between light-skinned blacks and dark-skinned blacks. So, but it's fascinating to see that back then.
Yeah.
And also to see their service started as just companies of blacks in the before the 1762 Havana siege, but that's where they came to the fore. But they also had volunteer enslaved men forming companies with the permission of their owners, and performing great feats of valor during the 1762 siege. So much so that some of them were freed and put into the free black battalions or free mulatto battalions. But then it goes on through to the American Revolution and their service in New Orleans along the Mississippi, and then in Spanish Florida, or in British Florida. But then it goes back into the 19th century, where they start to suffer from racism from the whites, from the Cuban whites, the Spanish whites. So yeah, both of those stories are fascinating.
Interesting. Yeah. We're talking with John Rees, who is the author of Don Troiani's Black Soldiers Serving in North America's Founding Wars, as well as They Were Good Soldiers on African Americans Serving in the Continental Army. And a couple of things. One, you mentioned that Pebbles was a matros and that a lot of the British were the pioneers and so on. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about, fighting roles versus service roles, and as well as what these guys are paid. Are they paid the same as white soldiers, or are there enslaved people paid at all for their service?
Well, the black pioneers, the northern contingent of black pioneers, who basically were slaves their entire military service, they were paid. Now, if you compare it to the Continental Army, sometimes the masters that enlisted their slaves, sometimes they took all the wages, sometimes they took half the wages, and then allowed the slaves to keep half. And in that way, some of the men were able to buy their own freedom, even before the abolition of slavery in the North. But by and large, unless they were enslaved by an officer, like a British or a loyalist officer, they receive pay. Yeah.
Okay. Another thing that you mentioned, in your first book, you do talk more about the women who accompanied the armies, and you have a couple of stories of Hannah Till and Judith Lyons. You have interesting stories. So what were the women doing, and what kind of women were involved in, following the Continental Army? What were their roles? Can you tell us a little bit about some of these individuals?
Well, armies attract followers. They attract both male and female followers. Both males and females are there to maybe make money off the army. Sometimes as sutlers, sometimes in other ways. The armies, and especially George Washington, he wanted to make sure that that women with the army did something to earn their keep, and also were upstanding people. And so in the beginning, and even all the way through to 1783, there were problems. But by and large, the women who followed the army were respectable and respected. And if they weren't, they were eventually not with the army anymore. Some women joined the army for short periods, and maybe some women even came and went. Some women stayed for long periods of time, like the white woman Maria Cronkite, who was with the New York Regiment, and she followed her husband for most of the war. But Hannah Till, she began the war as a slave. She ended as a free woman. I'm not sure exactly, when she gained her freedom, but her master basically hired her to Washington for his military household, and she was a cook with him at least. Well, I think it's from 1776 almost through the end of the war. Her husband Isaac also was with Washington's military household, and Isaac actually may have been at the Battle of Trenton. Hannah was actually with on the Pennsylvania side of the crossing to the Delaware, basically with any baggage that was there, and basically waiting for Washington to come back. Probably had a cooked meal for him when he finally came back. But she went on to she was at Valley Forge. She actually had a son at Valley Forge, gave birth to a son at Valley Forge, who was he was baptized in a church in Philadelphia the year after. So yeah, she saw a lot of amazing service. Judith Lyons, I wrote an entire article on Judith Lyons, and just to cover basically her whole life. But she's fascinating because when she met her husband John Lyons, she had already been married. Her husband had passed away. He may have passed away actually in militia service early in the war. We don't know that for certain. But at that point, I think she already had 3 children when she married. So she was left at home taking care of the farm, whatever holding they had. They did have at least 1 cow or a couple cows, so she had to care for that on her own. Possibly with the help of maybe family or maybe some neighbors, but we just don't know. But her husband would write her letters from the army. And at one point he asked her to come. So in 1782, she was with the army probably from May or June until September or so. But during that time, she actually got smallpox too.
Oh, wow.
Which, if anybody's familiar with smallpox, it's a horribly disfiguring disease, and it's a very likely deadly disease too. The soldiers probably were not inoculated, because by and large Washington tried to inoculate all the soldiers. But I don't know. She could have been inoculated and still got smallpox, but she did have it. We just don't know about that.
Interesting.
And then she testified later, and I haven't been able to corroborate it, but she testified later in the pension that her one son fought at the Battle of Chippewa Farms and was wounded and died of his wounds. But I haven't been able to find his name in any of 1812 materials in the soldiers' list. So he either changed his name or he was, So there was possibly a timeline all the way through from the Revolution, up to the War of 1812.
Very interesting. Did you find any other? I mean, your book does go up to the Civil War. I wonder if you find any other continuities like that, or if you're able to.
Well, I wanted to try to deal with women in the army too, in that book, in the second book, but there just wasn't room. So I really didn't delve into it. There are. I mean, we know in the Civil War that there were black women who followed the army for a lot of different reasons. Some were nurses, some were teachers, and they ended up in the South during the war, teaching children. And I'm sure I think there might actually be a photograph of a black woman in camp that I've seen. Well, I'm not sure of the date though, but it's inevitable, because whenever you get, well, in the Civil War, of course, the regiments were segregated. But whenever you get men on campaign from basically since time immemorial, and then even into the late 19th century, and you also see it into the 20th century to a certain extent, just not the same numbers, but you always have their wives or their loved ones following them in the military.
Interesting. Jonathan does remind us that we know of at least 4 black veterans of the Revolution whose descendants then are in the Massachusetts 54th during the war. So we have that. Also, that tradition of service is something.
Yes, yes, yeah. And actually, I in my in the Bunker Hill caption, I talk about that because there were, I think there were 2 in the 54th and 1 or 2 in the 55th Massachusetts as well too. Yeah. And yeah, and those were those, and the reason I put them in Bunker Hill caption because their fathers were veterans of Bunker Hill.
Well,
yeah,
it's interesting. It sounds like you have enough material for a couple of more books here, John.
I would actually like to do a book just on the black regiments. That served just during the Revolution, because as I said, they alone have fascinating histories. And the thing is, the first Rhode Island segregated, it only lasted as a segregated regiment for 2.5 years, and it was an outlier in the Continental Army because the rest of the army was integrated.
Yeah.
So that that's it didn't. And the reason it failed as a regiment was because it couldn't get the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really no fault of its own or the fault of the men, because they halted slave enlistment after like 4 months because for some reason it was not popular in Rhode Island. And it may be because it may have caused unrest among the slaves.
Right.
Because the masters had to agree to it. And of course they were paid, the masters were paid, and then upon enlistment, the men were freed. So they served as free men.
Interesting.
But I guess with that option being open, I assume, the enslaved people, they always knew what was going on. They always knew what was happening. So they were probably, causing trouble for their masters, asking to be enlisted, and so they become free men. That's the only reason I can see why it would have been unpopular. But they did stop slave enlistment, and then they did continue to enlist free blacks and free Indians, but there was never enough to fill the full regiment.
Interesting. We've been talking with John Rees, John Rees, who is the author. His most recent book is Don Troiani's Black Soldiers Serving in North America's Founding War, 1754 to 1865. His previous book, They Were Good Soldiers, on African Americans Serving in the Continental Army. Thank you so much for joining us, John. This has been a fascinating.
Yeah, it was a really nice conversation, and as I said, I really appreciate you invited me. It's an honor.
Glad to have you, and I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our man behind the curtain, and our listeners around the country, around the world. Every week we thank some folks who are tuning in regularly, and if you're in one of these places and want some Rev 250 swag, or you just want to ask Jonathan a question, his email is jlane@revolution250.org. And this week, I want to give a shout out to our listeners in Richmond and in Winston-Salem, in Dallas, Towson, Maryland, in Detroit, Michigan, and here in the Bay State, in Boston, Somerville, East Hampton, and Orleans, and all places between and beyond. Thanks for joining us. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.